Hello again, men. I'm so glad you're back with us as a part of this session of Men's Fraternity as we've been working through the book by Max Stiles, Evangelism. And so far, we've looked at the definition of evangelism, if you'll remember, which is teaching the gospel with the aim to persuade. We also defined what the gospel was, and so that definition being as the joyful message of God that leads to salvation. But over the last couple of weeks specifically, we've really begun to look at developing a culture of evangelism within the church, and then connecting the church to that culture. So today I want to spend just a few minutes looking at chapter 4 and talking about being intentional evangelists in a culture of evangelism. If we look at the scriptures in Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 and 20, a very familiar passage that you all are aware of. It says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." There, as Jesus is giving that instruction, He's telling us to be intentional about going and making disciples. And so, I'll just be honest with you. As a believer, I have to confess that at times it's been very easy for me to assume that the church is evangelizing. So it's not imperative that I do it. And sadly, that can often be the case for many of us. So today I want to share 6 things that Max Stiles says we can do to be intentional about evangelism. First, it starts with preparing our own hearts, minds, and feet. And we can do that by really asking 3 questions. The first question is, are we motivated to share the gospel? Touching the heart. As individuals and the church as a whole, we need to ask, are we motivated? Do we have a compassion for those who don't know Christ? Are we often discouraged by the hardness of people's hearts and need a word of encouragement in regards to that? And another question, are you really convinced? Are you really convinced that there's no one too far gone to be saved by the power of the gospel? Are we equipped to share the gospel? Is your mind equipped? It should be present in our worship. The gospel should be present in our worship music. The gospel should be present in our preaching. And the gospel should be present in our prayer. The third thing is, are we available to share the gospel? Are we available to share the gospel? Are our fellowships welcoming to non-Christians? And now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying for us to lose our aim of worshiping and glorifying Jesus, but are we making people that come in and visit feel welcome when they come to visit? The second point that we can do, or the second thing we can do, is to make sure that the gospel remains central in all aspects of our worship. In other words, we can't let what men want to hear slip into the church, into our music, into our preaching, into our prayer. We must keep the main thing the main thing. We see that in Paul's correction of Peter in Galatians chapter 2. Like some of us, Peter had become fearful of men, and Paul's rebuke was just really meant to remind him, to remind us of the importance of keeping the main thing the main thing. Oftentimes we can be misled into thinking that living a moral life is the same thing as sharing the gospel. Living a moral life is actually impossible, while living a gospel life is a gift from God. So how do we live it out and keep the gospel central? We keep everything about our lives rooted in the gospel. When we do that, we live the gospel-centered lives, we will find ourselves naturally sharing the gospel. Third, we need to kill assumptions. So often, I think one of the biggest and most dangerous problems in our church today, or traps that we can fall into, are assuming that everyone that comes to church is a Christian, or everyone that's regularly attending church is a Christian. Let me tell you, assuming the gospel is eternally deadly. We assume this by just assuming that those people who attend a Christian fellowship, or who attend a Christian school, or who attend a Bible study know Jesus personally and have a relationship with Him. We need to kill those assumptions. We need to be intentional about conversations, especially about conversations with those that we may assume know Jesus personally. Don't assume that because someone grew up in the church, or they're a preacher's kid or a deacon's kid, that they know Jesus personally. Just because someone knows a lot about Jesus doesn't mean that they know Jesus. And I also want to just encourage you to keep talking to your children. For those of you who have raised your children in the church, please don't assume that just because they've been in the church their whole life that they know Jesus. Have those conversations and be intentional about them. Fourth, I think we should practice the discipline of evangelism. How do we get good at things? We practice them. Whether it be sports or music or whatever that may be that we love to do, we get good at it because we practice it. In other words, we schedule time to be intentional about practicing. Do you do that with evangelism? Do you intentionally schedule time to share the gospel? Don Whitney says, unless we discipline ourselves for evangelism, it is very easy to excuse ourselves from ever sharing the gospel. We need to plan for it. Do you plan for sharing the gospel? Fifth, don't underestimate the power of prayer. Charles Spurgeon prayed this: Lord, save the elect and elect some more. Make it a regular practice to pray for the lost and to pray for opportunities to share with the lost. Don't just wait for special events or services. Get down on your knees and pray for the lost that are regularly attending our church and the lost that are in our community. And then finally, just to be honest with you, it starts with your leadership. And I will commit to you that your leaders will model evangelism in our own lives, that we will keep it a priority by reminding you of it and talking about it regularly. We will also offer opportunities to better equip all of you as members of this church to share the gospel. So with all that said, I just want to encourage you and to challenge you all not to get comfortable about sharing the gospel, not to get lackadaisical, but to be intentional about evangelism. Thank you, and have a great discussion.